On January 23, 2025, a significant development emerged in U.S. China trade relations when Chairman John Moolenaar, Republican, Michigan, and Congressman Tom Suozzi, Democrat, New York, introduced the Restoring Trade Fairness Act. This bipartisan legislation represents the first effort to revoke China's Permanent Normal Trade Relations (PNTR) status since it was granted in 2000. The introduction of this bill is rooted in a broader context of concerns regarding China's economic practices, which have been viewed as detrimental to American workers and national security. Historical context. In 2000, the U.S. Congress voted to grant PNTR status to China as it prepared to join the World Trade Organization (WTO). The hope was that this move would encourage economic liberalization within China. However, over the past 2 decades, the outcome has been markedly different. The United States has experienced a significant decline in manufacturing jobs, rampant intellectual property theft, and a strengthened Chinese Communist Party (CCP) that poses a growing geopolitical threat. Proponents of the Restoring Trade Fairness Act argue that the PNTR status has facilitated these adverse effects by allowing China preferential access to U.S. markets. The Restoring Trade Fairness Act. The Restoring Trade Fairness Act seeks to reverse this trend by eliminating China's PNTR status and imposing new tariffs on Chinese goods. The proposed legislation outlines specific tariff rates, a minimum of 35% on non-strategic goods and a staggering 100% on strategic goods, with a phased implementation over 5 years. Additionally, the bill removes the de minimis treatment for China, requiring customs brokers for certain shipments and aiming to mitigate the CCP's economic coercion and labor exploitation. Senators Tom Cotton, Republican, Arkansas, and Jim Banks, RIN, have introduced companion legislation in the Senate, underscoring the bipartisan nature of this initiative. Moolenaar emphasized that this act is essential for national security and for rejuvenating domestic manufacturing, while Suozzi highlighted its role in ending preferential treatment for the CCP, which has been linked to job losses and diminished U.S. economic integrity. Economic and security implications. Supporters of the bill argue that revoking PNTR is vital for safeguarding U.S. national security and reducing dependency on China. The Restoring Trade Fairness Act builds on previous bipartisan tariff measures implemented across 3 presidential administrations. According to a report from the United States International Trade Commission (ITC), these tariffs have not significantly contributed to inflation but have encouraged diversification in supply chains, reducing reliance on Chinese imports in critical sectors. The legislation's phased approach to tariffs is designed to minimize disruption while steadily increasing economic pressure on the CCP. The strategic goods identified in the bill are based on the Biden administration's Advanced Technology Product List and China's Made in China 2025 plan. Reactions and next steps. The Restoring Trade Fairness Act has garnered support from various stakeholders, reflecting a rare moment of unity between Democrats and Republicans in confronting China's economic practices. Moolenaar noted that this bipartisan consensus marks a significant victory for U.S. interests, while Suozzi pointed to the damaging effects of current trade policies on American workers. As the bill moves forward, it is expected to undergo further scrutiny and debate in Congress. The outcome could reshape U.S. China trade relations and signal a shift towards a more confrontational policy that prioritizes American economic interests and national security over previous engagement strategies. In conclusion, the introduction of the Restoring Trade Fairness Act signifies a pivotal moment in U.S. China relations, reflecting growing frustrations with China's trade practices and a collective desire among U.S. lawmakers to restore fairness in trade and protect American jobs. The legislation represents a critical step toward re-evaluating the long-standing trade dynamics between the 2 nations, aiming to secure a more equitable economic environment for American workers and businesses. The Restoring Trade Fairness Act, introduced by Chairman John Moolenaar and Congressman Tom Suozzi, represents a significant shift in U.S. trade policy towards China, aiming to revoke the country's Permanent Normal Trade Relations (PNTR) status. This bipartisan initiative underscores a growing consensus among U.S. lawmakers regarding the perceived failures of the past 2 decades in engaging with China through trade. One counterintuitive element arises from the historical context of the PNTR status itself. Initially, granting PNTR was seen as a strategic move to encourage economic liberalization within China, with the expectation that such engagement would lead to a more open and democratic society. However, the subsequent outcome has been the opposite. Instead of fostering a liberalized economy, the U.S. trade relationship with China has arguably resulted in the strengthening of the Chinese Communist Party's CCP and its state-controlled economic model. This illustrates a disconnect between the intended benefits of free trade and its actual consequences, challenging the conventional wisdom that trade invariably leads to political liberalization. Another counterintuitive aspect lies in the proposed tariff structure within the Restoring Trade Fairness Act. While typically increased tariffs are associated with higher consumer prices and inflation, proponents of the bill cite recent reports from the United States International Trade Commission (ITC) indicating that previous tariff measures have not meaningfully contributed to inflation. Instead, they have encouraged businesses to diversify their supply chains away from China. This challenges the common narrative that tariffs are inherently inflationary, suggesting that under certain conditions tariffs can be a tool for reducing dependency on a single foreign market without significantly impacting U.S. consumer prices. Furthermore, the bill's approach to strategic goods, imposing a minimum 100% tariff, highlights a strategic shift in prioritizing national security over traditional economic considerations. This contrasts with previous economic policies that largely emphasized the benefits of free trade and globalization, illustrating a new paradigm where national security concerns are taking precedence. This shift raises questions about the future of global trade dynamics and the potential for increased protectionism as countries reassess their economic relationships based on geopolitical realities rather than purely economic interests. The bipartisan nature of the Restoring Trade Fairness Act itself is also noteworthy. In an era where political divisions often lead to stalemates, the unity among both Democrats and Republicans on this issue suggests a rare convergence of interests that transcends typical partisan lines. This cooperation challenges the perception that trade policy is solely a partisan issue, indicating a broader recognition of the challenges posed by China's economic practices. In conclusion, the Restoring Trade Fairness Act not only seeks to revoke China's PNTR status but also reflects deeper shifts in U.S. trade policy, where historical assumptions about trade liberalization are being reassessed in light of contemporary geopolitical realities. The counterintuitive findings surrounding the expected impacts of tariffs and the bipartisan support for this legislative effort highlight a transformative moment in U.S. China relations and the broader landscape of international trade. In the report regarding the introduction of the Restoring Trade Fairness Act, several important aspects are likely to be overlooked by the general public, but they hold significant implications for U.S. China relations, domestic manufacturing, and national security. 1. Historical context of PNTR status. One of the most critical points to grasp is the historical context behind the granting of Permanent Normal Trade Relations (PNTR) status to China in 2000. This was a pivotal moment driven by the belief that integrating China into the global trading system would lead to economic liberalization and political reform. However, the expectation that engagement would reform the Chinese Communist Party's CCP has largely been perceived as a failure. The significance here lies in understanding how this historical miscalculation has shaped current trade dynamics and policies. The failure of the PNTR initiative underscores the risks of relying on engagement as a strategy for dealing with authoritarian regimes. 2. Bipartisan nature of the legislation. The bipartisan support for the Restoring Trade Fairness Act is noteworthy. It represents a rare instance where both Democratic and Republican lawmakers have united against a common external adversary, reflecting a significant shift in U.S. political consensus regarding China. The importance of this bipartisan consensus cannot be understated, as it may signal a broader and more sustained policy direction that could influence future administrations irrespective of party affiliation. This unity indicates a collective acknowledgement of the perceived threats posed by China to U.S. economic and national interests, which could lead to more robust and coordinated actions in the future. 3. Tariff structure and economic strategy. The specifics of the proposed tariff structure are significant, especially the differentiation between strategic and non-strategic goods. The legislation proposes a staggering minimum tariff of 100% on strategic goods and 35% on non-strategic goods phased in over 5 years. This nuanced approach demonstrates a strategic economic policy decision aimed at protecting key industries critical to national security, particularly in sectors identified in the Biden administration's Advanced Technology Product List and China's Made in China 2025 plan. Understanding the implications of this tariff strategy is crucial, as it not only seeks to protect American industries but also aims to reduce U.S. dependence on Chinese manufacturing. This could reshape global supply chains and possibly lead to inflationary pressures in the short term, affecting consumers and businesses alike. 4. Impact on U.S. supply chains. The report mentions the impact of previous tariff measures on supply chains. The fact that tariffs have not significantly increased inflation while encouraging diversification of supply chains is a crucial insight. Many people might overlook the potential long-term benefits of supply chain diversification, which could enhance U.S. economic resilience. By reducing reliance on China, American businesses may become less vulnerable to geopolitical tensions and trade disputes, allowing for greater stability in the future. This shift in supply chain dynamics could also stimulate domestic manufacturing and create jobs, countering the narrative that tariffs invariably lead to price increases. 5. National security implications. The explicit connection made between revoking PNTR status and enhancing national security is a significant area that may not receive adequate attention. The bill aims to curb the CCP's economic coercion and labor exploitation, particularly concerning the use of forced labor in regions like Xinjiang. By framing the legislation within a national security context, it underscores the idea that economic policy is not merely about trade but is intrinsically linked to geopolitical strategy. This perspective is vital for understanding why the U.S. is willing to take such drastic measures to protect not just economic interests but also democratic values and human rights. 6. Funding for U.S. defense and manufacturing. The bill proposes that tariff revenues be used to support U.S. farmers and manufacturers and to purchase munitions vital for deterring CCP aggression in the Pacific. This dual use of tariff revenue reflects a strategic approach to align economic policy with defense needs, emphasizing that economic resilience is a cornerstone of national security. This aspect may be overlooked in broader discussions about trade and tariffs, yet it highlights the interconnectedness of economic and military strategies in contemporary U.S. policy. 7. Long-term economic vision. Finally, the overarching vision of the Restoring Trade Fairness Act is to reset the U.S. China economic relationship fundamentally. By codifying tariffs and ending PNTR, the bill signals a long-term commitment to re-evaluating and restructuring how the U.S. engages economically with China. This shift may lead to an era of increased protectionism, but it is framed as necessary to safeguard U.S. interests. The long-term economic vision encapsulated in this legislation could set the stage for future trade negotiations and international economic policies. Conclusion. In summary, the Restoring Trade Fairness Act is not just a legislative action, it marks a pivotal moment in U.S.-China relations with deep implications for national security, economic strategy, and domestic manufacturing. The historical context of the PNTR status, the bipartisan nature of the bill, the specific tariff strategies proposed, and the broader implications for supply chains and national security are all critical elements that deserve attention. The act represents a significant shift in U.S. policy reflecting a growing recognition of the challenges posed by China, and it sets a potentially transformative path for future U.S. trade and economic relations. Understanding these nuances will be essential for grasping the complexities of contemporary international relations and economic policy. 1. Bipartisan support. The introduction of the Restoring Trade Fairness Act signifies a rare moment of agreement between Democrats and Republicans on the issue of U.S. China trade relations. This bipartisan effort highlights a growing consensus on the need to address the economic practices of the Chinese Communist Party's CCP that have been perceived as detrimental to American workers and national security. By uniting across party lines, lawmakers are acknowledging the urgency of revising trade policies that were once thought to promote liberalization in China but have instead resulted in significant job losses and economic challenges in the U.S. 2. Historical context and assessment of PNTR. The act aims to revoke China's permanent normal trade relations PNTR status, which was granted in 2000 under the belief that it would lead to economic liberalization in China. However, over 2 decades this status has resulted in the decline of U.S. manufacturing jobs, increased intellectual property theft, and the strengthening of the CCP as a geopolitical adversary. This historical assessment is critical for understanding the motivations behind the bill, as it reflects a shift in U.S. trade policy from engagement to a more confrontational stance, driven by the perceived failures of the past. 3. Tariff strategy and economic protectionism. A core component of the legislation is the establishment of new tariffs, 35% on non-strategic goods and 100% on strategic goods. This strategic tariff structure is designed to protect U.S. industries and jobs by making Chinese imports less competitive in the American market. The phased implementation of these tariffs over 5 years indicates a strategic approach to gradually increase economic pressure on China while allowing U.S. businesses time to adjust. This aspect of the bill underscores a significant shift towards economic protectionism, reflecting concerns about national security and economic resilience. For economic and security implications, proponents argue that revoking China's PNTR status will enhance U.S. national security by reducing dependence on China and curbing its economic aggression. The legislation aims to address not only economic concerns but also broader security issues, including the implications of relying on a geopolitical adversary for critical goods and technology. The bill's supporters contend that strengthening U.S. manufacturing and supply chains is essential for safeguarding national interests and promoting economic stability in the face of rising global tensions. This dual focus on economic and security dimensions represents a comprehensive approach to re-evaluating the U.S.-China trade relationship. 1. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act 1930. This act was a significant piece of legislation that raised U.S. tariffs on hundreds of imports. It was designed to protect American industry during the Great Depression but led to retaliatory tariffs by other countries, resulting in a steep decline in international trade and exacerbating the global economic downturn. The backlash against the act exemplified the dangers of protectionist policies. Much like the current bipartisan push to revoke China's permanent normal trade relations PNTR due to perceived economic threats and job losses in the U.S. 2. The Trade Act of 1974. This legislation was pivotal in shaping U.S. trade policy, allowing the president to negotiate trade agreements that could reduce tariffs and other trade barriers. It included provisions for the revocation of Most Favored Nation (MFN) status for countries that violated human rights or engaged in unfair trade practices. This historical context mirrors the current Restoring Trade Fairness Act, which seeks to revoke China's PNTR status based on similar concerns about economic practices and human rights violations such as forced labor. 3. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment 1974. This amendment was part of the Trade Act of 1974, specifically targeting the Soviet Union and other non-market economies. It linked trade benefits to human rights practices, effectively denying MFN status to countries that restricted emigration. The amendment was a response to Soviet policies and served as a tool for U.S. foreign policy, similar to how the Restoring Trade Fairness Act aims to use trade policy to address China's economic practices and human rights issues, signaling a broader geopolitical strategy. The introduction of the Restoring Trade Fairness Act by Chairman John Moolenaar and Congressman Tom Suozzi on January 23, 2025 represents a significant pivot in U.S. China trade relations. This bipartisan effort to revoke China's permanent normal trade relations (PNTR) status signals a growing consensus in Washington about the need to reassess America's economic relationship with China, reflecting long-standing concerns over trade imbalances, intellectual property theft, and national security. Future outlook. 1. Bipartisan trade policies. The increasing bipartisan support for aggressive trade measures against China may lead to more comprehensive legislation aimed at curbing Chinese economic influence. This trend could foster a new era of U.S. trade policy that prioritizes national security and domestic manufacturing over previous engagement strategies. But collaboration between Republicans and Democrats could pave the way for a series of laws designed to protect U.S. interests, potentially leading to a more adversarial stance towards not only China but other nations perceived as threats to American economic stability. 2. Impact on U.S. China relations. As the U.S. implements stricter tariffs and trade restrictions on China, it is likely that diplomatic relations will further deteriorate. China may respond with its own retaliatory measures, which could escalate tensions between the two nations. This could manifest in various forms, including increased military posturing in the Asia-Pacific region and more aggressive economic policies aimed at counteracting U.S. influence globally. 3. Manufacturing resurgence. The goal of revitalizing U.S. manufacturing jobs through the Restoring Trade Fairness Act could lead to a renaissance in American manufacturing. By imposing higher tariffs on Chinese goods, the U.S. may encourage companies to relocate production facilities domestically or to other countries. This shift could create jobs in sectors previously weakened by outsourcing, particularly in industries like electronics, textiles, and automotive components. For supply chain diversification, the bill's emphasis on reducing reliance on Chinese imports is likely to accelerate supply chain diversification. Companies may seek alternative sources for manufacturing and materials, potentially leading to increased economic ties with countries in Southeast Asia, India, and even Eastern Europe. This diversification could help mitigate risks associated with over-reliance on a single country and enhance the overall resilience of global supply chains. 5. Inflation and consumer prices. While proponents of the bill argue that the tariffs will not significantly impact inflation, there may be unintended consequences for consumer prices. Increased costs for imported goods could lead to higher prices for consumers, particularly if companies pass on these costs. This situation may require careful monitoring, as political pressure may arise if inflation affects consumer sentiment, negatively influencing future elections. 6. Investment in domestic industries. The revenue generated from tariffs could be strategically reinvested into American industries, particularly in technology and defense sectors. This could lead to advancements in innovation and production capabilities, positioning the U.S. as a leader in cutting-edge technologies. Investments in research and development could further enhance the competitiveness of U.S. industries on a global scale. 7. Geopolitical alliances. As the U.S. takes a firmer stance against China, it may seek to strengthen alliances with other nations that share similar concerns about Chinese economic practices. This could lead to the formation of new trade agreements or coalitions focused on promoting fair trade and countering China's influence in global markets. Such alliances could reshape the geopolitical landscape, creating blocs that work collaboratively to address shared challenges. 8. Human rights and labor practices. The legislation's focus on addressing forced labor practices in China, particularly concerning Uyghur labor, may catalyze a broader movement towards ethical sourcing and corporate accountability. As consumers become more aware of the implications of their purchasing decisions, companies may face increasing pressure to ensure their supply chains are free from human rights abuses, potentially leading to changes in business practices globally. 9. Long-term economic strategy. Ultimately, the Restoring Trade Fairness Act could be seen as part of a larger strategy to redefine America's economic objectives in the 21st century. This could involve reassessing trade agreements, reconsidering globalization's benefits, and focusing on sustainable economic growth that prioritizes domestic production, job creation, and national security. 10. Potential for economic decoupling. As both countries adjust to a new trade paradigm, the potential for economic decoupling, where the U.S. and China increasingly separate their economies, could become a reality. This decoupling may lead to a bifurcated global economy, with countries aligning more closely with either the U.S. or China based on their economic interests, values, and political alignments. Conclusion. The Restoring Trade Fairness Act signifies a pivotal shift in U.S. trade policy that could have far-reaching implications for both domestic economics and international relations. As the U.S. navigates this new landscape, the outcomes will depend not only on legislative actions but also on the responses from China and the broader global community. The coming years will likely witness significant changes in how the U.S. engages with China and how it prioritizes its own economic interests on the world stage.